Welcome to Photoactive, a podcast about photography and technology. I'm Kirk McElhearn.
And I'm Jeff Carlson.
You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. So, Jeff, which color iPhone are you getting?
I think it's hilarious that you have to ask. The blue, of course. The blue is awesome.
Of course, it's the one true color, right? It's the only color to get this year. I'm getting one too, and I was originally going to try and maybe keep my iPhone 11 a third year, but with all the camera improvements, even though I don't really take a lot of pictures with my iPhone, I wanted to be able to try these out and experience them. And unfortunately, we don't have pre-release iPhone 13s here, but we are intelligent enough to read what everyone else has said about them. So we're going to talk about the iPhone 13 camera improvements.
I'm really surprised that you decided to go ahead and go with it, because this is one of those releases, and we've said this before, with the iPhone, Apple really hammers on the cameras, because this is the camera for most people.
Well, it's because there's not much else they can do in an iPhone to make it better.
Well, you know, it's faster. It's got all of those other kind of, whizzy. Hey, you can play rich 3D games that I honestly play once, and I'm like, yeah, okay, yeah, that seems to work.
Every year, it's the fastest iPhone ever.
Isn't that amazing?
That just doesn't, I know.
How do they do it?
That just doesn't sell it anymore. And if you remember, in this latest presentation, they did not once use the term magical.
Oh, wait a minute. You're telling me my phone is not going to be magical?
It is not magical.
Oh, man, I should probably...
It's Pro.
Okay, well...
As Apple's webpage for the phone says, oh, so Pro. Is that like a reference to something I don't understand? So I'm totally down for the surgical grade stainless steel. I mean, I think that's just awesome. I don't know what I'm going to use my iPhone for where I need surgical grade stainless steel. However.
Well, yes.
I hope I never have to find
exactly. You don't want to have to field strip your phone to make surgical instruments out of it.
Exactly.
But I can say that as someone who has had the iPhone 12 Pro, which is also made of the surgical steel, I really like this design. It has always felt good in my hand, even though it's not as rounded as before. Just the fit and finish of the 12, I've really enjoyed over the 11, and so I think you'll like the 13 partly for that reason.
Wait, you're the guy who doesn't use a case, right?
Of course not. Why would anybody use a case?
See, that's the thing. I cannot use an iPhone without a case.
I totally understand that.
Even though I buy AppleCare, I'm an hour's drive from an Apple store. So if I do break an iPhone, it's a half day. I had the battery on my iPhone 11 replaced in June under AppleCare, and it was a half day. It was an hour's drive. I had to wait 2 hours. So it was another hour drive back. I can't do that just because I don't want to use a case.
Yeah.
My house was built in the early 1800s, and in the hall and the kitchen, there were these big, massive flagstones. And I have dropped my iPhone several times in the hall and the kitchen. These are the only places where it's not carpeted.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to take that chance.
No, that makes complete sense, and I get it. I've just never wanted the cases. But what was interesting about this is they always talk about the cameras because the cameras are really cool. But this time, like, they led with the cameras. This was all about the cameras. And, oh, by the way, the phone can do other stuff, which I think is how a lot of people think about their phones, and certainly how we think of them as primarily cameras. But I was a little surprised that it was so camera heavy this time.
I kind of think it was last time. I mean, if we were to go back in time, the presentations, I don't think it would be that different, because when was the last time you can remember a major new non-camera feature? And I'm not talking about removing the headphone jack.
Yeah, I think my silence is really saying everything.
I think it's around like the iPhone 8, because that was the first one that had the larger model. No, the 7 had a larger model as well.
7 had a larger model. I mean, if you want to go like super big, I think Retina screens, which I think were in the 4, when the screen resolution really started to improve.
I think it's later than that, but we're not going to bother checking it, because this is a photography podcast, and we're going to talk about the wonderful camera features in the iPhone. Now, I want to start with the thing that's like the big flashy thing, because here's what I don't understand. I have never really thought that I want to take videos of people and do focus pulling to shift from one to the other, right?
Ah.
And so they go with this presentation and they get a real director, Catherine Bigelow, up there, and she's talking about all this. And it's like, I don't want to see a director using this. I want to see someone at a kid's birthday party using this. I want to see someone at a Little League game. I want to see what the real people are going to do with this. Yes, if I was a film student, I was 20 years old, I would be salivating over this. This and a gimbal, and you can go to Cannes. But normal people, how are they going to use this? I want to see this in real practice.
Okay, so to back up really quick, you're talking about cinematic mode, which
cinematic mode in quotes. I'm doing the air quotes.
Which is, I think, extremely fascinating and super clever. And I want to know more about it just from that side of things. And what cinematic mode will do is let you rack focus or pull focus or change focus from one person to another or one object to another, sort of foreground, background. And it has that sort of blended effect that you'll see in a lot of movies.
You'll see it in every movie and every TV show. Anytime you've got close-ups, two people in a car, it's constantly going back and forth from one to the other.
So to answer your question, I do think people will probably play around with this. And, at sporting events, maybe that'll work. Ultimately, I think it's probably not something that most people will use. It'll be like a lot of things. They'll try it out. They'll say, well, hey, honey, look at this. I can make you go in and out of focus. Isn't that cool? And that's fine. And then for the people who are really into it, they'll really dig it. For, like you said, the 20-year-olds who are making their own short movies and things.
So 0.1% of people who are buying the iPhone are going to just love this.
Yeah.
And the rest of them are going to try it out, and it's not going to quite work. See, what's cool is it can do this automatically. So it can do face detection, and if you've got two faces in the frame and one turns to the other, it's automatically going to shift the focus. That's pretty cool,
super cool
from a technological point of view. Even better, you can tap a focus point. Let's assume you've got this on a tripod or holding it steadily enough. Or the optical image stabilization available in all four iPhone 13 models will keep it more or less stable.
Yeah.
You can tap another focus point to pull the focus. But even more impressive is that you can do this in post-processing on your Mac or on your iPhone or iPad.
That part actually is what has blown me away the most about this feature, because it's all done in software.
No, it's not.
It is.
No, it's not. It's not that it's all done in software. It's that you've got two cameras recording at the same time. So you've got a video stream, which is the two cameras, and the software is letting you shift from one to the other. The software is not making this up.
No, it is. It is.
No, the depth effect is created by a second camera. It's the same as in portrait mode.
No. The two cameras working together is figuring out what the depth is of the scene, but what it's actually recording is everything in focus as much as it can. And so it's artificially adding the blur and then changing the focus based on it. That's why you can change it after the fact. So what you're looking at is basically portrait mode for video that's very malleable.
Okay.
And that's what really impresses me, because apart from the quality of the effect, which in some cases looks really good, in some cases it may not be, I think overall it's a lot better than what a lot of people would expect. And I think for most people, you're not really going to notice that, oh, maybe this is done in software. But the fact that in real time, it's processing this blur and processing the focus and making the transition between the two different areas. Computationally, it's kind of amazing. And just the flexibility of being able to mess with that later blows my mind.
Okay, fair point. No, I thought it was recording two streams, and it was basically overlaying, because they didn't show this year, but last year they showed like the multiple images that are taken to do the smart HDR, and I thought it was a similar kind of thing. Okay, so that's impressive, but I still don't think there's a lot of real world application for this.
No, I don't think so either. But it's also one of those things, and this is a very Apple thing, where it's a cool technology, it's head turning, it is making you. I can't believe you just did that. Yes.
Yes, listeners can't see. I just
He
turned
just
my
turned
head.
his head. Even on a podcast, we are not immune to visual jokes. It's something that Apple knows people will talk about and get people interested
Yeah.
in. And most importantly, it will make people think, oh, this is a very cool feature. Maybe I can do something with it. And that will make them decide, well, maybe my 11 Pro or my iPhone 11, which I could have gotten another year or two out of, maybe I should consider this 13 because this is a cool feature that I want to play with. Now, after 3 or 4 weeks and you realize maybe you're not doing it anymore, or you're only doing it, every once in a while when you have sort of a video shooting opportunity and you're like, oh, right, I forgot cinema mode was here. Sorry, cinematic mode was here.
Cinematic, yes.
That's okay because they've already sold you this phone. So it's kind of that snazzy thing, kind of the same reason why Apple uses directors like Catherine Bigelow or big-time photographers in all their marketing and stuff, because it has that aspirational aspect of, oh, this is something that I would never have considered doing, but now I can do it. And what does that open up for me?
I want to talk about a couple of things. They have a longer telephoto lens this time, and unlike last year, you get the better lens on both of the Pro models and not just the Pro Max, which I think when they did that last year, it just kind of felt weird.
Yeah.
Why am I getting the Pro when it's not really the Pro? It's really the Pro Max is only the Pro, so I'm getting the kind of middling amateur kind of phone.
I think that was really a physical space issue, because if you'll notice, the iPhone 13 Pro this year, the camera block, the camera bump, where all the cameras are, is noticeably larger and a bit deeper this year. And I think it was just a matter of, in the 12 Pro Max, they had room to put this in, and I think kind of field test it, really. So when you talk about having the better camera, let's explain what that is.
So instead of having 2 cameras, ultra wide and wide, you have 3, and the telephoto is a 77 millimeter equivalent focal length, which, if you consider that 50 millimeters is roughly what we see in reality, so this means it's actually a telephoto where you're seeing things bigger than they are, right? And this is great for portraits because you generally want a longer lens for portrait photography than, not that you can't do portrait photography with a wide angle lens, but it's more often the kind of lens you're going to use for portrait photography. So this I think is a pretty good thing.
Also, I think there are definitely people who will take their phone on vacation, and this will be the only camera that they use, and having a little bit more reach there. So Apple, I think in the interface, refers to this as a 3x zoom for the telephoto. Having a little bit extra reach will just compel people to buy the Pro because they want that telephoto, they want that zoom, even if, I mean, realistically, you're not going to see something in the far distance much better, but it definitely helps a little bit. And I think that's a really compelling thing for a lot of people. One thing to notice is that it's not as fast as last year's telephoto. So the aperture is f2.8.
You mean the aperture's smaller, right? The maximum aperture is a bit smaller.
Yeah. So it's not going to let in as much light. But there's also that sort of point of middling returns where the phone's going to compensate anyway by increasing the ISO and applying noise reduction and all of that. So I don't think in a practical sense that's going to affect a lot of people unless you're shooting in really dark situations.
Yeah. And as you say, for vacation, it's going to be just good enough. It'll be an improvement from what you're seeing in the normal, what they call the wide, which I'm looking at the specs here. The wide is 26 millimeter focal length, the ultra wide is 13, and the telephoto is 77. So that is a big difference from 26 to 77. Yeah. Remember, these are 35 millimeter equivalents, but still, that's quite a large difference.
Yeah, definitely. And also going back to the apertures are much better on the wide and the ultra wide than in the past. So the wide is now an f1.5. The ultra wide is now f1.8. In the iPhone 12 Pro, the ultra wide was an f2.4. And that's where, combined with night mode and deep fusion and all of that, you're just going to get more light hitting the sensor. That's just going to help overall. And I think, I actually don't have it in front of me, the the pixels are larger in these two cameras?
Well, the pixels, they're pointing out the size of the pixel only for the wide camera, not for the others. And I believe they're a little bit larger. So the overall sensor is a little bit larger.
Yeah.
And it says the wide is 100% focus pixel. So that means that your autofocus is going to be more efficient than the other two cameras.
Yeah. Also helping with the autofocus, the wide has the sensor shift optical image stabilization, which is not just the regular stabilization. So you're going to get a little bit of stability when you're shooting video, but also you get that sensor shift stability when you're shooting in low light conditions, which also helps.
The day before this Apple presentation, Apple published a support document saying that driving on powerful motorcycles with an iPhone could damage the sensor shift optical image stabilization in the iPhone 12. During the presentation, they show a guy driving a moped around some city doing deliveries, and it's like, I felt that was just a bit. Couldn't they have waited till the next day to publish that document or something?
They probably should have.
Now, obviously, what they were talking about is people who are mounting the iPhone on the handlebars rather than this guy who was holding it in his hand relatively unsafely, driving with one hand some of the times.
Well, and he was in a scooter. He wasn't on a big old motorcycle.
He wasn't on a high-power motorcycle. Yeah.
But yeah, I thought that was pretty funny.
Let's also point out that the Pro models have LiDAR, and this means for low-light photos, you're going to get better focusing. So they're talking about night mode selfies as well, so the front camera's better.
Yep.
So it's like this is the best camera ever on an iPhone. It's the fastest iPhone ever.
It is the fastest. It's the best.
It's just amazing. It's just, I can't imagine how good it is. And Smart HDR4, because last year was only Smart HDR3, and we had to do better than that. So we did the same thing and named it 4. I mean, how do we even know? I'll tell you what I like, though. They've added what they're calling photographic styles. Now, every sort of photo editing app has presets or styles or things like this. And you can create presets and styles with every single adjustment on your photo editing app, your Lightroom or whatever. Apple Photos doesn't do this. Here they have 4 styles: vibrant, rich contrast, warm, or cool. And they say you can fine tune them even further. So this is kind of like in camera, you're making your adjustments. In our Fujifilm cameras, we have the film simulations. In other cameras, there are styles and things like that. So in camera, you can make adjustments of like the tone and the warmth to make something, to make a look that you like. Okay, so there's something else that this camera can do, and we actually spent an hour talking about this before. We should have recorded all of that for the extra special thing. And it's like the iPhone 13 can do photography.
Oh, no, don't even.
Basically,
you can say the word.
They're calling it macro photography. Yeah, it's not like the B word. They're calling it macro photography. Is not macro. It's close-up photography. Macro photography is when the picture is bigger than the original item, or at least 1-to-1 ratio. This is a photographic term that's been around forever. Now, you disagree. You think that I'm being picky, and it's a marketing thing. If they're doing this for average people who aren't photographers, they'll think, okay, this is cool. But a photographer who knows what a macro lens is going to say, well, no, this isn't macro photography.
Okay, well, let's take a quick step back and say exactly what it is on phone and how they've implemented it.
Right, because there is a problem with it.
Well, yeah, there is a problem which has come up. We're recording this just as the first wave of reviews has come in. We don't have these in hand, of course. And it seems like a pretty clever implementation. Normally, when you want to make macro photography, you get a macro lens. And here, of course, you don't have a macro lens. And for ages and ages, you could buy, quote unquote, macro lenses that you add on top of the current lens and all of that. But then you're just adding stuff. And I've always found it to be a little bit clunky.
Plus, those lenses never work on 2 subsequent models of the iPhone because the shape and the size of the camera module is different.
And so what Apple's doing here is they're using the ultra-wide camera in a quote-unquote macro mode. I'll get to that in a second. And the ultra-wide camera has a really close focusing distance, 2 centimeters.
But just a term, it's not a macro mode. It's not like you move that little slider and do macro. It just happens automatically.
Exactly, which is actually a bit of confusion that we ran into at first, because I assumed that macro mode was going to be like portrait mode or time-lapse mode.
Right.
And
Or cinematic mode.
Or cinematic mode. And what happens instead is the camera is making a determination based on how close you are to a subject. And once you're certain amount close to something,
some of the reviewers are talking about it being about 5.5 inches.
Then the camera is thinking, oh, you must be doing a macro shot, so we're going to switch into this macro mode where it switches to the ultra-wide camera. Now, the problem that's come up that Apple has said they're going to fix in a subsequent update is that automatic shift that's happening is really noticeable. It is really clunky. Like, I like the idea of it in that, oh, it's just going to do the thing for you. That's a very Apple thing. But what happens is you've got this sort of bumpy thing where you're very clearly going from one camera to another, and the whole thing shifts, and it looks clunky. We'll put a link to a video in the show notes to show what this looks like.
The problem is that if you're at that point at about 5.5 inches, and you're not on a tripod, like you're holding it in your hands, you're going to be moving slightly, and the camera's going to be going from one to the other. And what you can see in these videos is the difference in parallax. So let's say it's the top camera or the bottom camera, so the angle is different. Now, what I said, and Jeff didn't really agree, is that I can't understand how Apple could be so sloppy to ship this, because this is the length. This is the distance at which people are going to photograph their dinner to post it on Instagram. Yeah. So they must have had plenty of people who'd noticed this.
Yeah, well, we don't have really insight into how they're testing the new cameras. And, you know, it could also be this is the type of engineering thing where they know it's an issue, and that's why today they can say, yeah, we have a fix planned to come out based on early response.
Well, they only announced that today because the first reviews came out. So they're going to add a setting later this fall. You notice there's a lot of stuff coming later this fall. Like, what is it? The Apple Watch is later this fall, and fall ends on December 20th, I think. So we've got a ways to go.
It makes sense to me that they would ship this actually for that specific reason, because they need to ship this. And yeah, it's not that great, but they had to implement all of this software in the firmware weeks and weeks ago when they started production. So sure. I'm willing to give them a pass, but you're right. It's sloppy.
Yeah. One thing to note is, so what this is doing is it's switching from the 1x camera to the 0.5x camera, but it's keeping the same size. So it's doing an optical zoom. So you're losing resolution when you're doing a close-up photo like that. When you can see in the video that it's keeping objects the same size, so it's shifting and it's losing half the resolution. I guess roughly half the resolution, depends on the distance.
So that's kind of been one of the dirty secrets of the iPhone for a long time, is it will switch cameras based on available light, especially with the telephoto lenses, which tend to be darker because the apertures are smaller.
Instead of f1.8, it's f2.8. The number's bigger, the aperture's smaller. Right. Everyone gets confused about this, even photographers trying to describe the difference between bigger and smaller and wider and narrower and all
Exactly. So what the cameras have been doing is when it senses that there's not enough light to get a good picture, it will switch to the wide camera, which has a wider aperture, and just use digital zoom to recreate the zoom level. And I'm guessing that it's still doing that, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so I think this is an interesting feature, this close-up thing. Mm-hmm. Some of the photos that I've seen have a lot of fall off in focus. So on the Apple website, they got a photo of a flower. The center is in focus and the rest is blurry. Nice effect.
Yeah.
If you do want to get something more in focus, you might not be able to do it. So it's obviously, this is not macro photography for photographers with macro lenses. This is close-up photography for people who see a nice flower or a butterfly.
I think that's a very good way of putting it. So one of the things that we went on about before we started recording was whether or not to call this macro. And I think we've come to the point where we sort of agree that, yes, this is not technically macro photography in the way that a lot of photographers know about it. However, for most people, that doesn't really matter whether it's super technically accurate, because what you're getting is the effect of a super close-up image. To me, macro is that composition.
I do want to mention the sensor resolution. They're still at 12 megapixels, and yet an analyst said something yesterday or today, who's generally pretty well plugged in about what Apple's doing, is that next year they'll be coming out with a 48 megapixel sensor. Now, I know there are some Android phones that have big sensors like that. It's kind of hard in such a small space. Does Apple really need to go to 48? Couldn't they go to 24? I mean, this is all speculation.
Yeah.
I think they're years past needing a bigger sensor. They could do so much more with their computational photography if they had 24 instead of 12 megapixels.
Well, so, I think that is at the core of why we have not seen much resolution improvement. So if you remember from our episode when we were talking about sensors and megapixels, one of the things that struck me was the speed at which you are taking data from the sensor to the processor and processing all of that. And so when you have a 12 megapixel camera, that's just a lot less data that it can work faster on. And obviously,
but this is the fastest iPhone ever.
It is the fastest iPhone ever. But maybe that's not even fast enough with their coprocessors and all of their custom silicon. Maybe they just can't get the performance of all this computational photography that they're doing, the cinematic mode and all of that. Maybe they just can't do that yet with more megapixels. One of the things about the cinematic mode is it will only shoot in 1080p 30 frames per second, I think. And I believe that is strictly because there's just so much data that it's working with in real time.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes to a video that Jordan Drake did reviewing the iPhone 13. Jordan did a video this week alone without Chris Nichols because Chris, he said, shoots Android phones and he doesn't care about the iPhone. And he made a number of observations about the iPhone cameras. One thing that we haven't mentioned is it uses ProRes, and ProRes is this thing that people who make films like to use. I don't even know what it is. I think it's kind of like the RAW for video.
It is.
For, film video.
Yeah.
And he said, I really don't want to use it because you're limited in the resolution you can use. And he said with the 1080p on the 12 megapixel sensor, you're less likely to see the sort of jaggies around people's hair and things like that. Worth pointing out that it will only do the ProRes in 4K if you have an iPhone with at least 256 gigabytes of storage. So that's because there's so much data that this uses. And since there's no real quick way to get the data off, it doesn't have a Thunderbolt connector. Imagine it. You've got 50 gigabytes of ProRes on this thing. You're not going to put it in the cloud. You're going to connect it to your computer. You're going to wait 6 hours to get it all off.
Well, no, wait. It'll just go through the cloud, right? And so 18 hours later, you'll be able to get it.
Yes.
Yeah. With professional video, ProRes.
But it's got the fastest 5G ever.
It's got the fastest 5G. Yes. Oh my God, wouldn't that be hilarious if 5G to the cloud was faster than going out through the Lightning port?
Yeah.
Anyway, ProRes is actually a very big deal in the video world. It's a very efficient codec, and it gives good quality and all of that. And so I think having that on the iPhone, there will definitely be some people who are really excited about that. That's also why there's now a 1 terabyte storage option for the iPhone, because of having so much of that video. It's also not coming until an update later on, so that's going to be
later this fall. Like everything,
I think that's probably something that for people who are shooting a lot on iPhones, and actually there's a lot of iPhone video that gets shot, second unit, inserts, cutaways, things like that, that will help editors on the back end because they're using the same format and all of that. But
right, more consistency.
I will shoot something in ProRes and say, yep, I did it, and maybe write about it.
Now what?
Yeah. But
Okay.
for some people, again, going back to what we said earlier, this aspirational of, I can make a video that has professional qualities to it with my iPhone. And it's cool.
When I was in the early 1980s, I lived in the Upper West Side of Manhattan for a couple of years. I lived with a friend who I'd known for a few years. We shared an apartment. He was going to NYU Film School. So I remember the equipment that they had back then. Okay, 40 years ago, but still, I can just imagine someone in film school right now looking at this and thinking, for $1,000, I have this amazing, if it shoots 1080p, if it shoots 4K and does all this, everything you can do, it is quite impressive.
Yeah.
So there are people around the world who, the 0.1% of people who buy these who are film students or amateur filmmakers, whatever, for whom this will make a big difference. And I think that's impressive in some ways.
And also, I'll include a link to a video that I watched just randomly. I think because I clicked on something that said cinematic mode. So of course YouTube gave me all sorts of things about cinematic. But there's a guy who is a filmmaker, I think, an amateur filmmaker, and he does these movie essays that are quite good. And he was talking about like what is cinematic mode, because we try to think of, is it because it's in 16:9 aspect ratio? Is it the depth of field, all that kind of stuff? But one of the things that he pointed out, which I think is totally true, this $1,000 iPhone 13 Pro, when you're working at that scale of larger productions and bigger equipment, like $1,000 is nothing. This is the thing that you strap onto the car expecting that it will get destroyed, and it's no big deal.
When you're ready to make a film, let me know.
I make films all the time. They're just very, very short. That's because I accidentally forgot to turn off the live video feature. Anyway, I'm looking forward to getting this and taking some photos and seeing what the differences are. I think ultimately it's not going to practically be a massive update in terms of, my photos are going to be twice as good now. But it's also one of those things, if you've been holding on to an iPhone 10, then you move up to something like this and it's going to be a big deal.
Okay, Jeff, time for our snapshots. What have you got?
I've got a book.
No.
Seriously?
Dude.
I know. We switched places here. It's called 2020 Unmasked. And it's a group of a handful of photographers in different cities, basically looking at the year 2020 and how politics and the pandemic and all of that affected just the last year. And part of the reason that I wanted it was just because it has been such a crazy, odd year. I just wanted some sort of a visual representation of it. It's beautifully done. It's hardcover. It's a big, beautiful photo book. The photos are from Washington, D.C., Boston, New York City, and the book is $85, which seems pretty reasonable for a large hardcover book like this. The print quality is excellent. And honestly, part of me, I'm just a little tickled that I finally have a book to show for our snapshots.
I'm looking at their website, 2020unmaskedbook.com. And when I click on images, what I find interesting is all they show is black and white images. Are there no color photos in it?
There are color photos in it, although most of it is black and white. And actually, it's interesting because when you do come on a color one, like sort of at the beginning, for example, there's a lot of black and white, and it's talking about the election in the U.S. And then you turn the page, and there's this color photo of Trump supporters with all their bright red and blue Trump flags, and it's a really striking difference from all the others.
But just another sign how black and white photography has value, and seeing black and white photos of things like this gives them that sort of reference as documentary photographs.
Yeah. I'm telling you, I think there's a future for black and white photography. What do you have this
I have
week?
a flash, and I know this isn't very interesting. I have a Godox TT350. Be honest, it doesn't matter which model it is, because I've never really shot with a flash. I think back in the film days, I may have a little bit. And I bought this maybe 2 years ago, definitely pre-lockdown, thinking I need to learn how to use a flash. And it just sat in my photography stuff drawer. This afternoon, I had put this on my to-do list a couple of weeks ago, learn to use flash. And I keep moving it to the next day. And then this afternoon, I had a couple hours, and I took it out, and I started messing around with it. I know nothing about using a flash. And it's yet one of the basic photographic tools. And so my point of this being a snapshot is find something you don't know how to use and try to figure it out and learn how to use it, because that's going to change things. So I started looking at YouTube, some videos. We had a brief discussion before the show. We're going to do an episode at some point in the future about using a flash, because no one really thinks about it. When you shoot on your iPhone, the flash comes on automatically. So, it just happens when you need it. But when you've got a flash stuck on top of the hot shoe on a camera, it's a different process.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I think honestly, one of the reasons why we haven't really talked about it is because flash photography can be this giant subject. And so, I mean, it's certainly nothing we can just cover in one episode in terms of, the foundations and how to shoot with one and all that. And I mean, just looking at it from that perspective as someone, when I first started shooting with strobes and flash, it's daunting. It's just intimidating. I will say a great resource is strobist.com. A photographer named David Hobby set up this site. And actually, I think he's no longer updating it, but it has like 101 instructional stuff that will get people started, and it's a great resource for just learning the basics and building up from there.
And the thing is that there's a big difference. We had a long discussion before the show. There's a big difference between a single flash on a camera and multiple lights. And there's a lot you can do with just that one flash, just like on the iPhone. But there's a lot you can do going forward if you're shooting photos that benefit from a flash.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Next time we talk, we should both have the new iPhones, and we'll be able to say a little bit more about it. But next time we talk will not be for several weeks, because you're going away, aren't you?
I'm going to go away. In fact, we're going to take a week off, and I'm going to be on a photo adventure, which will be great, but it means that I'm not going to be around to record.
Okay, well, enjoy your photo adventure, and I hope we can see lots of photos when you come back. Thanks for listening to Photo Active. You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. We couldn't afford the M. You can join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/photoactivecast. That's photoactivecast in one word. You can subscribe to Photo Active in your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts. See the links on our website. And think about leaving us a rating or review in iTunes or in your podcast app.